but with this amount of faces comes the reality that we have exceeded capacity, and the university is gracious enough to allow us to continue with that exceeded capacity. But that is to say, if others are running late, if you have friends, peers, colleagues that would like to join but are running late, they will be directed either to the live stream or to a satellite location to witness this. So we at this point can cap the room, despite not wanting to stifle the circulation anymore. We can attempt to close the doors and begin the open dialogue. With that, I apologize for my formal attire, but it hides my nervousness and insecurities. So this is what you're offered. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this open dialogue entitled Critical Perspectives on the Crisis in Gaza. My name is Tony Beal. I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago's Divinity School and president of the Divinity Students Association. Today, it is my duty to outline the standards for this discussion, introduce our panelists, and moderate the discussion following the opening remarks from each of our panelists. Please allow me to begin by describing what this event is and what this event is not, as I understand it, both as a moderator and representative voice for the DSA board. Despite being graciously housed here in Swift Hall, it is important to understand that this gathering is not a Divinity School event. Additionally, despite being hosted by the Divinity Students Association, this conversation is also not a DSA event. This event is, in fact, a student-led initiative with the support from university faculty across divisions and departments. Accordingly, the DSA board believes that our role is to respond to the concerns of the Divinity student body and to support the healthy academic and social lives for the students that we represent. And so, to be clear, the DSA's affiliation with this event is not an endorsement of one political stance over another. Rather, it is a recognition that the educational environment for many within our student body has been negatively affected by recent global events. The DSA board, therefore, after careful consideration, decided to respond to requests from members of our university community to host this event. Now, in order for this discussion to contribute to the revival of a healthy learning environment for all students at the Divinity School, and to serve as an example for generative discussions across campus, each attendee here today should understand and agree to certain standards for a productive dialogue. As members of a private institution for higher learning, we are, in essence, in the business of thoughts and ideas. And so we should be willing and ready to productively discuss the thoughts and ideas that most dramatically shape our collective lives. More specifically, this is not a space to spout anti-Semitic ideologies, nor is this a space to perpetuate Islamophobic rhetoric. As contributors to this renowned academic space, it is worth reminding ourselves that relying on these simplistic, accusatory tactics denies the complexities and nuances that better reflect the history and lived experiences of those most directly impacted by recent increase in violence in the region we are about to discuss. We are privileged to be guided by our esteemed panelists, whose research allows them to effectively present the nuances and complexities that this sensitive subject requires. Moreover, this space is a place for communicating thoughts and ideas that can be shared in a respectful and responsible fashion. This event is an open dialogue that promotes the standard of freedom of expression that are firmly rooted in the history and policies of this institution. Above all, this event, at its core, is an opportunity to remember that our differences of opinion need not divide us, but rather through careful and informed dialogue, we can better recognize the humanity that unites us and move forward new and inclusive possibilities for the future. With that, allow me to introduce our panelists. Callie Madoff is Assistant Senior Instructional Professor and Associate Director of the Global Studies Program. She is a social cultural anthropologist with research and teaching interests in the state, middle-class cultural politics, religion and secularism, and settler colonialism. In particular, she is concerned with how the anti-political practices of everyday life have been cornerstone to the expansion of the Israeli state into the West Bank. Relevant publications for this occasion include her book, Borderline Settlers, Israel's Secular Middle Class in Palestine. Alireza Dostar is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and Anthropology of Religion at the Divinity School and in the college. His research investigates the complex entanglements between religion, science, and the state. His most relevant publications for this context are the essays How Not to Understand ISIS, published in Sightings 2014, and Our Palestinian Scholars Are Colleagues, Boycott and the Material Limits of Friendship, published in Savage Minds 2016. W.J.T. Mitchell is Professor of English and Art History and editor of Critical Inquiry from 1978 to 2020. His most relevant publications for this occasion are Cloning Terror, The War of Images, 9/11 to the Present, and Seen Through Race, based on 2012 Du Bois lecture at Harvard University. And Iman Abdelhadi is Assistant Professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development. Her research focuses on the intersection between religion, gender, and identity. Recent related publications relevant to this discussion include Reexamining, Reconstructing, Racialization, Religious Conservatism and Political Leanings in Contemporary American Life, published in Social Forces 2020, and The Hijab and Muslim Women's Employment in the United States, published in Research in Social Stratifications and Mobility 2019. Without further delay, I now invite Professor Madoff to provide her opening remarks, followed by our other panelists, after which we'll invite attendees to participate in this open dialogue by raising their hands. I will circulate with the mic accordingly. And we thank you for your attendance at this lively discussion.
If I talk with it right here, can everybody hear me? This is good for the, yes? Good, excellent. So first of all, thank you so much to the DS.
Can I ask the sign language interpreter to maybe move a bit closer so that people on the video...
Actually, I'm not able to do it for one night.
Oh, I see. I'm so sorry.
I'm so sorry.
Please continue.
Well, then I think it's good. I get to thank twice the DSA for organizing this event and for including me in it. Also, thank you for the great introduction. My book, maybe you'll call it Into Being, because it's definitely not out yet, but I liked hearing that it was. that was like a really good moment for me. So thank you. I want to start out by saying something that maybe nobody will like, which is, I guess, a good way to start a panel, right? Which is that Hamas is a distraction, or at least questions about Hamas are distraction. Now, what I don't mean is that the death of 1,400 Israelis, mostly civilians, are a distraction, and I don't want to minimize or excuse that. To explain, I will take a detour and talk about Israeli settlers, which is what my book that doesn't exist yet will be about. In quote-unquote quieter times, it's often West Bank settlers who make the most noise with their prayers, their many children, their M16s, right? Settlers are Jewish Israeli civilians who moved to the West Bank in contravention of international law. And they're most famous for doing what they're doing right now, actually, while we're mostly not paying attention to that side of the country, which is assaulting and attacking Palestinians, killing them, and taking their land in a variety of ways, whether it's by paving roads, by destroying crops, or simply by depopulating villages. In the last 12 days, 64 Palestinians have died in the West Bank, and 2 full villages have been depopulated, Al-Qanub and Wadi as-Sik. Now, these numbers are obviously dwarfed by Gaza, where 3,500 people have died, and what I understand is an average of 1 child every 15 minutes. But I think it's instructive to think about what's happening in the West Bank in order to understand the narrative strategies that make what is a genocide popular among not only Israelis, but among many people across the world. So a lot of people may think that studying settlers would be a wild ride into the heart of religious extremism. I'm going to share with you something nobody has ever asked for, which is some highlights from settler Facebook that I found today. So these are just some posts just from the last couple of days from the community group, which is of the settlement that I study, which is in the northern West Bank. So wanting to support the war effort, there were multiple calls for pedicurists to donate their services to active duty military. There was one person who waxes eyebrows who said that they would also be able to join in if that was relevant. There were, of course, a lot of posts with information on obtaining gun permits. There was a complaint about potholes that had damaged a car in the settlement, and videos of people blasting music, including kids' music and also the Jewish prayer, the Shema, in order to, quote, shout back even louder against the sound of the call to prayer in neighboring Palestinian villages. One person, in response to that, asked, why hasn't Israel cut off their electricity yet? Now, this is in addition to normal posts about, like, AC repair, happy birthday, where can I get a really good cake? And that may seem really bizarre in light of everything I just said about settlers. But most settlers are not like the ones I just described. They're actually a pretty small minority of settlers in the West Bank, about 83,000 Jewish Israeli settlers who live on the so-called outposts, out of the total of around 700,000 settlers, which is around 1 in every 10 Jewish Israelis living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So what does any of this have to do with Gaza? Now, the settlers I talked about earlier, they're violent, they're callous, and they're also a distraction. They distract, and more importantly, they make possible the massive colonization of the West Bank, and they do so counterintuitively, not because they steal land, although they do, not because they are killing and displacing Palestinians, although they do, but actually because they provide a foil for other Jewish Israelis so that they can say, well, I'm not a settler because I'm not like them. When I ask the settlers in the settlement that I study how they feel about settlers, I know I'm using that word a lot, but they don't identify as it. They say, oh God, settlers? Like they're crass, they're religious extremists, we're secular, we're modern, we own our homes, we buy them. And so by focusing on the actions of these settlers, which we need to shed light on, right? But by focusing exclusively on them, we've provided cover for hundreds of thousands of Israelis to move into the West Bank with a clear conscience, because they're not settlers like that, because they don't recognize them in those accounts. So returning to Hamas, Hamas's attack was horrific, and I think it was a war crime. And I think the questions about Hamas are a distraction. So neither attacks by Hamas nor violent settlers should be overlooked or understated in importance, and comparing them is also not helpful. But what they both accomplish politically is they distract from the same thing, which is a massive settler colonial project which at the present has turned to genocide. So to say that Hamas, or even the settlers, with 83,000 of them, and with increasing Israeli government and army support, to say that they drive this quote-unquote conflict would be ignoring that truth. And as long as we allow ourselves to be distracted by questions about whether Hamas adequately represents Palestinians in Gaza, or perhaps even how we feel about their tactics, we are also providing cover for what is actually happening, right? Which is that this is not an Israel-Hamas war. Because Israel is not at war with Hamas. Israel is at war with Palestine. Palestinian people, and with Palestinian, it was so articulate there, but with Palestinian children, right, who are 50% of the people who live in Gaza today, and who are dying in Gaza today. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Hear me okay? Yes? All the way over there? Yeah, okay, great. I also want to really thank the DSA and the students who invited me to participate. I think it's an enormously important discussion and one that we don't have often enough. One that I think and I wish that we could have in times of less extreme violence. There's never not violence, especially Israeli violence in the Palestinian territories, but we tend to get riled up and sort of want to have information when really genocidal level catastrophe starts to unfold. So I'm hoping that this can lead to many more conversations down the road, hopefully after there's some modicum of peace as well. So I want to talk about Palestinian traditions of nonviolence and nonviolent resistance and how they can inform solidarity work in the US and indeed at the University of Chicago. And as I was writing my remarks, I realized that I ended up actually writing a little bit about violent struggle as well, so I'll talk about that too. But first, the traditions of nonviolent resistance are important to recognize because they're too often ignored in Western public discourse, and because Western journalists too often pose some version of a condescending question to Palestinians, which is, where are your Mandelas, where are your Martin Luther Kings, where are your Gandhis, and so on. And even though, again, I want to focus on nonviolent resistance, I should say that I don't mean to delegitimize armed struggle. So like any other people under occupation, Palestinians have the right to both violent and nonviolent resistance. And indeed, questions about Palestinian Mandelas, louder? Okay. Yeah, is this good? Okay. So questions about Palestinian Mandelas and Dr. Kings often mischaracterize the views and legacies of both King and Mandela, usurping the traditions of these radical leaders and twisting them towards Zionist colonial ends. And indeed, if you're curious at all about what Mandela thought about the Palestinian problem, just Google Mandela and Kufia, and you'll get a nice picture, sort of visual representation of where he stood. I should also emphasize what should be obvious, that the right to engage in armed struggle is not a carte blanche for committing atrocities and war crimes. In the Palestinian case, however, the standard Western stance is to condemn every act of violent resistance a priori as terrorism, so that there's little or no space for distinguishing action against legitimate targets from atrocities against civilians. Of course, with Israel, it's quite the reverse, such that if you listen to mainstream networks, and certainly the words of the Israeli regime's American benefactors, we barely ever hear any mention of war crimes or atrocities, as though any kind of Israeli military assault is legitimate by default. And of course, you have the discursive acrobatics of human shields, collateral damage, they did it themselves, when it's impossible to deny that civilian deaths have occurred. And that's when Israelis are not completely collapsing the distinction between civilian and military, as when Israeli President Isaac Herzog did last week. He said, the civilians are, there's no distinction between the civilians and the military and Hamas, because it was the civilians who elected Hamas, they could have overthrown them. A logic which you can imagine what the logical conclusion of that would be if you reversed it, right? It would actually be very close to a kind of a Hamas logic, in fact. One final point before I get to nonviolent resistance, which is, while I don't think we should ever condone atrocities against civilians, we do need to open critical space for thinking comparatively about this form of violence and to de-exceptionalize Hamas and Palestinian violence more broadly. Civilian massacres are in fact quite close to the American experience, most explicitly in 19th century slave revolts and Native American anti-colonial resistance. I'll give you just two of the most famous examples. We have Nat Turner's slave rebellion in 1831, in which Turner, who was an African-American preacher, led a band of slaves in a short-lived uprising, which killed, really without any kind of discrimination, dozens of white men, women, and children. 3 decades later, there was the Great Sioux Uprising of 1862, known also as the Dakota War, in which Sioux warriors in Minnesota massacred hundreds of white settlers and took hundreds more hostage, mostly women and children. Of course, to think about Hamas in relation to the Sioux or to black slaves is not to legitimate war crimes, I should emphasize that, when committed by the oppressed, but instead to open a space for critical reflection on how we evaluate violence against civilians in a comparative anti-colonial context. Okay, so my focus again is nonviolent resistance. With all that, the Palestinian struggle has a rich tradition going back to more than a decade before the 1948 Nakba, so 90 years or so. This legacy includes strikes, work stoppages, marches, letter writing campaigns, boycotts, hunger strikes, and other tactics. The standard Israeli response to these actions, and before Israel existed as a state, the standard kind of British colonial response has been criminalization, arrest, violence, the razing of homes, and so on. Okay. That's it. In relation to Gaza, we might recall 2 significant nonviolent actions in recent decades. First, the Gaza Freedom Flotilla campaigns of 2010, 2011, and 2015 to carry humanitarian aid and attempting to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza by sea. When any ships in these flotillas neared Gazan waters, they were immediately intercepted by Israeli forces, who confiscated the materials on board and violently arrested the activists. In the initial attempt in 2010, Israeli forces notoriously shot and killed 9 passengers aboard one of the ships, the Mavi Marmara. And I mentioned this partly to emphasize that sort of the peaceful struggles in which Palestinians and their allies have been engaged, but also for us to recall this tradition, because we too often, I think, get bogged down in what's happening at this moment. You know, what Hamas did last week, what Islamic Jihad did 2 weeks ago, and so on, and we sort of lose track of this much longer tradition. Second, and much more significantly, there was the Great March of Return in Gaza, in which tens of thousands of Palestinians marched peacefully to the Israeli fence and demanded an end to the deadly blockade. This was so significant that there were news reports and commentaries coming out saying this looks like a turning point. There's a new sort of nonviolent Palestinian resistance emerging, and it's so significant. So much of Gazan society is taken up in this. And the protest marches lasted for almost 2 years, from March 2018 to December 2019. And of course, Israeli troops responded to these peaceful protesters with tear gas and live bullets, killing over 200 Palestinians and maiming or wounding a staggering 33,000, including men, women, children, medical crew, journalists, and people with disabilities. The final form of peaceful Palestinian resistance I want to talk about is the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, known as BDS. Modeled on the South African anti-apartheid movement, this 20-year-old campaign calls on allies everywhere in the world to bring nonviolent pressure on the regime by refusing to do business with the Israeli state, Israeli institutions, and corporations, with the final goal being the end of apartheid and a just political solution. What that political solution is, BDS activists are kind of non-committal about. You know, the question is, the issue is, let's get to the political discussion and then see what comes out of that. So whether it's 1 state, 2 states, and so on. The BDS movement has made significant gains in the United States and Europe in the past decade, particularly among academic associations, including my own association, the American Anthropological Association, which passed a BDS motion last year. For those of us in American universities, including here at the University of Chicago, BDS may be one of the most effective tactics for bringing nonviolent pressure upon Israel. So this is kind of the what must be done part of my talk. I want to talk about only one example that I think is too often ignored. It's right in our backyard and warrants serious consideration. One of the University of Chicago's collaborative projects with Israel is a high-level agreement reached in 2013 to fund, quote, a series of ambitious research collaborations that apply the latest discoveries in nanotechnology to create new materials and processes for making clean, fresh drinking water more plentiful and less expensive. Thus far, the organizations involved in this project have included not only the University of Chicago, but also Ben-Gurion University, Argonne National Laboratory, the United States-Israel Binational Science Foundation, the Israel Water Authority, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the Israel Ministry of Science and Technology, among others. This was so high level that when the signing happened between U Chicago and Ben-Gurion in 2013, The attendees included Shimon Peres, at the time president of Israel, and Rahm Emanuel, who was mayor of Chicago. And it actually happened in Shimon Peres' residence in Jerusalem. So what's wrong with this collaboration? Briefly, it's that just as UChicago assists the Israelis in developing better technologies for accessing clean water, Israel weaponizes water access against the Palestinian people. You will have heard, I'm sure, that after October 7th, Israel entirely cut off access to clean water for Gaza. But we might ask, why is it that Israel has such power over Gaza in the first place? Why is it able to cut off water in the first place? It's because over the past decade, Israel has not only maintained a severe blockade, but it has repeatedly attacked Gaza's water, waste, and power infrastructures, and stonewalled attempts at reconstruction. So during the Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip in 2014, water and wastewater facilities sustained significant damages, which hampered people's access to safe water and sanitation. The attacks damaged water wells, water networks, water tanks, desalination units, wastewater treating plants, wastewater pumping stations, and wastewater networks. And similar things happened to the power grid. So there was an actual power plant in the Gaza Strip that took severe damage in 2014. There was some reconstruction. Again, it was damaged in 2017, and so on and so forth. I don't know that there's a functional power station right now. And in any case, the power stations depend on fuel, so on fuel coming into Gaza, and there's, of course, a blockade there. It all depends on the good graces of the regime. While attempts have been underway since 2013 to reconstitute Gaza's water infrastructure, there have been multiple setbacks through a combination of Israeli assaults, blockades, and bureaucratic stonewalling. Last year, for example, Haaretz reported that Israel was holding up the entry of hundreds of vital replacement parts needed for the operation of Gaza's water and sewage system. This includes things like pipes, valves, basic stuff that you need to run a sewage and water system. The result was that drinking water sourced from Palestinian wells and aquifers were contaminated, increasing the threat of disease. And this is, again, it's like a slow politics of death. It's not a sort of intense, sort of bombing campaign. It's this really slow, low-grade politics of death. And why is it a politics of death? Because it creates disease, it hampers access to proper drinking water, and what kinds of disease? There's all kinds of microbial diseases, there's kidney failures, there's something like, I was reading, I think something like 30%, if I'm not mistaken, don't quote me on that, but something like 30% of disease in Gaza is somehow related to water access problems. The other result of this stonewalling was that Gazans were made ever more dependent on Israel for their own drinking water, which means that Israel can weaponize water against Palestinians in Gaza whenever it wants, and we now see its monstrous results. So really, it's not just the slow kind of politics of death, but also the rapid politics of death when needed, right? You can just shut that water off. So with something as simple, this is where I'll end, so with something as simple as collaboration in water research, the University of Chicago is itself both complicit with Israeli crimes and has the power to exert nonviolent pressure on the Israeli state to stop its crimes. And I think that's one of the places of many where we as members of the UChicago community can really demand that the university be responsive to us and make collaboration on these things, if you don't entirely cut them off, at least make collaboration on this sort of research dependent on respecting human rights, respecting the most vital human right of all, access to clean water. Thank you.
Is this loud enough? Can you hear me at the back?
Can you just make the mic a bit closer?
Well, I want to thank the organizers for bringing this event into existence and for inviting me to participate. I can't claim to be an expert. As you know, I'm an English professor and an art historian. My main publications about this have been written from quite a personal point of view. I don't speak Hebrew or Arabic, so I'm not a scholar of this situation. I'm more like a witness participant. First visit to Israel was in 1970, when my wife and I went to to visit a friend of ours who was marrying an Israeli, and we met Palestinians. We had a wonderful time. It was post-67 war, and the Phantom jets were flying over, and the Israelis were screaming, "Nixon, Phantom," which made us both very, very uneasy, not only with Nixon, but what the U.S. was beginning to do as long ago as 1970. Quite a few years passed before I went with my 12-year-old son to visit in 1987 at an Israeli university, the most right-wing university, I think, in Israel, Bar-Ilan, which held a conference called Landscape Artifact Text. And I wrote a paper for it entitled Imperial Landscape, which threw the apple of discord into the conference because I showed photographs, the very early photographs, of the settlements, the emergent settlements built like fortresses on hilltops, looking down on Palestinian villages. And the slow kind of violence that we just heard about was being manifested in the landscape itself, with settler occupation, the beginning of separate roads and highways, and the segregation of the occupied territories into places with good roads for the settlers, bad roads for the Palestinians. This happened to be November 1987. While we were there, the Children's Intifada, the first Intifada, broke out. A hang glider flew into an Israeli military camp, and the fighter killed several Israeli soldiers before being killed himself. The next day, a military truck driver drove into a crowd, I believe it was in Ashdod, and killed 4 vendors, people in markets, and the Intifada broke out. We felt like, I can't tell you how I felt. I was beginning at that point, 87, to feel like this cannot go on. It seemed like a breaking point, but clearly it was not. It went on. In 1998, I went with Edward Said, Rashid Khalidi, my colleagues, for a conference in Ramallah, in which we renewed the attempt to think through this. And here at the University of Chicago, we talk about the life of the mind. I'm all for it, but I'm always feel like I'm of 2 minds and 2 souls. I want to respect the historic tragedy of the Jewish people and their claim for a homeland, but I cannot accept the idea that the dispossession of another people, their violent dispossession, is an inevitable consequence of that. And I know so many Israelis who feel exactly the same way. Jewish Voice for Peace is, which I'm allied, and the Boycott, Divestment movement. I don't know if it was a good idea for me to join the BDS. The only consequence has been I can't go back to see my Palestinian friends or my Israeli friends. So I wish I had done it, but kept it secret. Not that anybody was watching. And I have been coming back even more frequently after that 1997 conference. I wish I could say something wise for you about what is to be done. All I can say at this moment, to me, and again, I'm so impressed by the command of the relevant literature on colonization, violence, slow violence, uprising, resistance, and so forth. What should be done now? I think Joe Biden has thoroughly humiliated himself and the country by taking a 20-hour flight and then getting off hugging the idiot Netanyahu and then flying back in disgrace after failing to make any kind of peaceful intervention. He did say one wise thing, which I'm trying to remember just to give him a tiny bit of credit. Oh yes, it was, can we learn, can the Israelis take a lesson from the American reaction to 9/11, which of course was disastrous for the Middle East. It was stupid, horrible, violent. Afghanistan and Iraq, still so many ruins from what they left behind. So let's give Joe credit for that, even though, of course, he voted for the invasion of Iraq. So what's to be done now? I think the proposals that are emerging make good sense to me. I hope the conference that the Egyptians are convening next week will produce some kind of program, but of course Israel will not participate in it. I think there needs to be an immediate ceasefire. Recently there have been calls from Hamas to release the hostages unconditionally if they would just stop the bombing and rocket attacks on Gaza. The idea that the bombing of this hospital might have been friendly fire strikes me as ludicrous when everywhere around you see entire neighborhoods being bombed flat, and nobody's denying that who is doing that. So that has to stop. The violence has to stop. They have to stop killing Palestinians in Gaza and, of course, all over the West Bank as well, which is going on as we speak. I'm involved with a project with Peggy Olin and David Shulman, both Jewish, David is an Israeli, to witness and monitor the destruction of Bedouin lives by the settlers. So stop the killing. Second, rush supplies, medical care, water, electricity, all the human services into Gaza immediately. It's a state of emergency right now. They keep saying, oh, the trucks are lined up at the Egyptian border, and so maybe tomorrow they might get in. No, no one can wait till tomorrow to have clean water or to get the medicine they need. So that's my second proposal. The third is the U.S. should immediately demand that Netanyahu step down. His incompetence and his vicious assembling of what basically amounts to a fascist government in Israel needs to be denounced. We need to separate ourselves from that side of Israeli politics and Israeli society and ally ourselves with the real majority of the Israelis who don't want this sort of thing. Then maybe we could have negotiations. Then maybe we could have a conference that would bring all the regional participants together. It's time to give the Palestinians justice, rights, their own land, their own autonomy, or even better, I've always subscribed to Edward Said's solution. They have to live together. They're together. They're both participants of what has been for centuries the Holy Land, the center of human civilization. Time to figure out how to live together.
Thank you so much to the organizers and the audience for being here today. My colleagues have done an excellent job of speaking about the past and the present in Palestine. And Tom, you talked a bit about the future. I want to talk more about a long-term solution to this conflict. And I'm speaking, both as a scholar, but also as a Palestinian and as someone who has long participated in the Palestine liberation struggle. I want to answer for folks in the room, what does it mean when you hear people say Free Palestine, right? When you hear that on the quad, when you hear that at a protest, what is the Free Palestine that we are envisioning? I want to say for a long time, the international community was attached to the idea of a two-state solution, and certain segments of Palestinian society were also attached to that idea, even though it would have given 78% of historic Palestine to the Palestinians. I'm sorry, 78% of historic Palestine to the Israeli state, and only 22% to Palestinians. That the two-state solution, whether we can argue all day about whether it was ever viable at any moment in history since the Nakba, since the creation of the State of Israel. But what seems clear to me now, and to many Palestinians both on the ground and in the diaspora, is that the two-state solution is no longer viable. For one, we already have one state, in the sense that what we have is one state that controls the lives of everyone in historic Palestine. Either they control it because they can blockade food, water, electricity, right? Can decide if an election is legitimate, or means that all the tax money of Gaza is going to be held back as it was in 2007. And because they have total control over Palestinians in the West Bank as well. The Palestinian Authority is largely recognized as a satellite government. They opened fire on Palestinian protests only 2 days ago. Israel does have the capacity to close off water and electricity and fuel to the West Bank. And that should tell you something. In no normal state relationship is that the case. Canada couldn't cut off food, water, electricity, and fuel to the U.S., right? That's not a normal two-state situation, right? You actually only have one viable state right now in historic Palestine, and that state is Israel. However, the setup is one of apartheid, right? If you have a situation in which you have one state controlling the lives of all the people in the region, and that state only has one group as citizens, right? And that's apartheid. And that's why Israel has been recognized by Amnesty International and pretty much every other human rights organization in the world as an apartheid state. Israel also treats its own Palestinian citizens, which are about 20% of the population, as second-class citizens. They carry different color ID cards, they have different rights. And so this all, so when we say that we want a one-state solution, what we mean is not the situation on the ground now. What we mean is a democratic nation in historic Palestine that gives equal rights to all of the residents of the land and allows for the right of Palestinian refugees to return. And that's a right that's guaranteed by international law. So that does not include the depopulation or removal of Jewish Israelis. And that is often a threat that, when folks talk about the one-state solution, that's something that is a Zionist sort of retort, is to say, well, these people were born here, and how could you? The one-state solution does not entail the removal of Jewish Israelis from the land. It does mean that settlements would need to be desegregated, that you would no longer have people's rights to the land dictated by whether they're Jewish or not, which is the situation right now. It would also mean that Jews abroad would not have an automatic right to settle in Palestine. Right now, even though my grandparents were born in Palestine, even though my grandmother died with the key to her house in Palestine, I have no right to return. However, someone born in Poland who is Jewish, whose grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-great-grandparents have never set foot on that land, has a right under Israeli law to move to Palestine and receive all the rights of citizenship. That would not work under a one-state solution. So that would mean that and it would mean the dismantling of the systems that currently control Palestinians' lives, the 500 checkpoints that rule over the West Bank. By the way, Google it, the West Bank, tiny piece of land. So to have 500 checkpoints there is wild. I can't think of a better word, I'm a millennial, it's wild. And so you wouldn't have an occupation wall, you wouldn't have checkpoints, and it would mean that Palestinians living in Palestine would have the right to benefit from the infrastructure that was built on their stolen land. does not make sense to envision a solution in which Palestinians living in historic Palestine that have been ghettoized over the last 77 years would now have no access to the roads built on their lands, the infrastructure of water, electricity, fuel. They should have access to those rights at minimum, to those resources at minimum. So what are the obstacles to a one-state solution? Some of you might be sitting here thinking, well, that sounds great. Why don't we do that? Yeah, that sounds great. Let's do it. One is the belief that Israel has a right to exist, right? When people say Israel has a right to exist, what they mean is that Israel has a right to exist as an eternal homeland for the Jewish people, which means that they are saying that Israel has a right to exist as an ethno-national religious state. No country in the world has the right to exist as such. And no country in the world has ever successfully lived as such. And so that needs to be dismantled. That the one-state solution cannot be that version of Israeli society. So the institutions of Zionism would have to be dismantled in order to build a free and equal society in historical Palestine. Another obstacle is the racist fear of retaliation from Arabs and Palestinians. That fear is unfounded. That was a huge talking point for advocates of apartheid in the South African struggle. And when apartheid was dismantled, we know that retaliation did not happen. Did it take? There were massive systems in place to sort of aid in desegregation, and they weren't perfect, and there's still a huge way to go. But there wasn't massive retaliation against white settlers. And this is, I think, related to the other fundamentally racist obstacle to the one-state solution, which is the belief that Arabs are savage barbarians who cannot exist in a democratic society. Israel regularly markets itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, which one might wonder how a democracy could possibly oversee such an apartheid system. But fundamentally, there is a belief that Arabs are incapable of self-rule. We saw that belief play out over and over the past 20 years of the war on terror. Many Israelis, particularly those who are Ashkenazi, fear the possibility of living in what is effectively an Arab country. Even among Jews, Israeli society is highly stratified by race, with Arab or Mizrahi Jews facing intensive discrimination. And Israelis often cite Arabs' high fertility rates as a reason to oppose a one-state solution. This kind of and that sense of threat from a growing population of people of color is so fundamental to white supremacist logic. It's a system that we see here in the United States as well. Things like the Great Replacement theory. So we really have to ask ourselves what it means for a place that claims to be a secular democracy, that its citizens cannot seem to tolerate the possibility of a society that's majority indigenous, frankly. And the irony, of course, is that we know that even if we did have this one-state solution tomorrow, Palestinians would not have equal political power. These people have been, again, ghettoized for the last 75 years. So Palestinians wouldn't have the same access to wealth. They wouldn't have the same access to these institutions that are existent in Israeli society. However, this is still a solution that far exceeds anything else, I think, on the political ground, and is one that is being advocated for by the Palestinian Liberation Movement across different spheres. So I want to take a moment for each of us, and bear with me here. It's weird to do this in a sort of academic space, but I want you to take a moment and think about, imagine that possibility of a free Palestine. Just take a moment and think about it. This is a piece of land that's a little bit bigger than New Jersey. You should be able to cross from one end to the other. You should be able to drive from Jerusalem to Gaza and have a picnic in like an hour and a half, right? Right now, that's almost impossible. The people who broke out of the concentration camp that is Gaza on October 7th, many of them had never been outside of it, had never seen Israelis in real life. again, on a piece of land that's as big as New Jersey, right? So I want you to imagine that piece of land without a border wall, without checkpoints, without an Iron Dome defense system, without heavily armed settlers, and without militant Palestinian resistance. So there would be no need. So I hope that you all take a moment to imagine that, and I think I'll stop there.
Thank you all for those thoughtful contributions to this discussion and for getting us started. We'll take a brief moment if any of you would like to respond to what you've heard before opening it up to the floor. Otherwise, we will start opening up the dialogue. Great. Now, I did mention moving around the room with this mic. However, based on the lack of mobility here currently, we've decided best to raise your hand, present your own question once called upon, and then if needed, I could do my best to reiterate your question or comment to the larger group.
Tony, just reiterate it for the cameras. And we have about 90 people on Zoom, so it might work.
Okay, sure, absolutely. So with that, I will open up the floor.
I know that's a very personal question to ask, but it's just so frustrating when these are our two options.
Thank you. So the question was, with both political parties in America seemingly supporting this division, how is it that we best respond with our own political means? Thank you.
Yeah, if I may speak to that just as an Americanist, as a scholar, and I study Muslim Americans' political leanings, I think that Biden has lost the American Muslim vote. And let me tell you why that's significant. He won Michigan, a swing state, by 150,000 votes. There are about there are 250,000 Arabs in Michigan, and there are 250,000 Muslims in Michigan. He won those two groups in 2020, and that was not insignificant. Muslims are concentrated in several swing states. The Democratic Party has told us for years that they are basically the lesser of two evils and have counted on the fact that we have nowhere else to go. And I think that people are done. I think people are done. I think also, more importantly, that this is extremely myopic on the part of the Democratic Party. As a demographer, I also care about cohorts, right? I care about what cohorts believe in what. And people by cohort, support for Israel goes down. So people under 30, not the majority of them, support like this intensive support for Israel. So support for Israel has gone down with every consecutive cohort, including among American Jews. There's a huge anti-Zionist Jewish movement that's growing every day. So the sort of long-term plan of the Democratic Party seems very unclear right now. So I think Biden, might have happened to him. I mean, this might be like what Vietnam for LBJ, right? This kind of like, we can't stand behind you anymore. I know Genocide Joe was trending on Twitter today, although I'm told that I pay too much attention to Twitter, which is feedback I'm trying to take in. But yeah, so I think that, I'm not sure what the sort of like, here's what we do at this point. I know that I will no longer vote for Joe Biden. I can't in good conscience do it. There has to be a right red line is not 1,000 dead Palestinian children, I don't know what is the red line. So I think that the best case scenario is we hope that the Democrats learn from 2024 in the future. I don't know what others think.
I'd like to just add one thought to that. I probably will vote for Joe Biden because I'm one of those people who goes for the lesser of two evils when that's what I'm faced with. But meantime, your question, I think, asks, what should we do now to inform ourselves, to be part of this generational alternative, which I think you're absolutely right, is emerging, that a lot of American Jews are fed up. The Arab population of the United States is growing. It's a demographic reality. One thing I think we need to notice what is happening with American news media. Since October 7th, I've been really alarmed that MSNBC, even the most left-wing of the cable channels, has sidelined all of its Arab-speaking commentators. They're no longer allowed to speak. The first couple of days, you could get actual news about what was happening in that part of the world. So we need to find alternate news services, and also, which is very hard, but not impossible, and we need to press the news services we have to live up to this notion of being, quote, fair and balanced, which I can't say those words without feeling waves of nausea. But in any case, that's what I would suggest.
I have only one sentence, which is politics is more than electoral politics. And that's it.
I second that. But also, I think one of the, just speaking, because I feel like everybody said good things, so I can just say for what's happening right now, one of the things that I find really horrifying is the way this, Biden is obviously playing, perhaps mistakenly, to the 2024 election, and that it's really obvious that that's what's behind, say, the U.S. vetoing a call for humanitarian pause at the UN, right? That it is that idea, that kind of jockeying for who has the most support for Israel, that is infecting this so much that you can't even call for a humanitarian pause, right? You can't use words like calm and de-escalate, and that it's horrifying. But we live in Illinois, so actually you don't have to vote for president, because it's not we're not a swing state, so we can vote for the other people who matter more, like our local aldermen. Just saying, because a not vote for Biden is not a vote for Trump in Illinois, at least. I don't know. That's me.
Thank you. And the floor is back open for questions, comments?
I have one from Zoom if there isn't a hat up.
I'm seeing, and then we'll come to the Zoom. Please.
First of all, thank you so much for your thoughtful contributions and for really articulating a vision of what it means when you say Free Palestine. I think that was really helpful to hear. And I'm thinking about the discourse here on campus. I'm also speaking as an American Jew, so I'm thinking about discourse in Jewish spaces. And in the lead up to this event, I heard from multiple people, I heard that's going to be kind of one-sided. And I saw in the middle of the quad today a pro-Palestine and a pro-Israel rally next to each other, yelling as loud as they could, not at each other, but kind of adjacent to each other, and was struck by this feeling of that's not dialogue. And I share your feeling that moving forward to a better future that has peace and justice for all of these people in the land requires all of those people, and it requires Jewish and Palestinian collaboration and solidarity. And so I just wanted to ask you to think about how do we move forward and help create those spaces? Like what does making that collaboration look like? And it's probably different here and there.
Thank you. So to reiterate for online, given our own divisiveness here between these communities at the University of Chicago, what can we do as students, student body members, staff, faculty to better provide a space to move forward that has been suggested by the panel thus far? So, thank you.
Well, and specifically you were also talking about the American Jewish community, right? And that's, I think one of the things, I think we need to have we really need a conversation about anti-Semitism right now. In part because it's being used as a reason that people are supporting the assault on Gaza. And in part because the assault on Gaza is not fighting anti-Semitism, right? That people feel less safe and are less safe, right? There was a synagogue that was firebombed in Berlin the other day. And so thinking, and speaking as a member of the American Jewish community as well, thinking about why is this the strategy for apparently keeping Jews safe, right? And is it in American Jews' best interest to position ourselves essentially as like Japanese in World War II, but in a good way, right? That ultimately our loyalties are to a different state at a moment when anti-Semitism is rising, right? And that people spent so long worrying about the supposed anti-Semitism of anti-Zionism that they didn't actually look out and notice the real rising anti-Semitism that was happening. So I think that's a really important conversation that needs to be had, and in a way that I don't really like the word both sides, but that in a way that like includes a lot of people. And one way to do that might also be, say, have a conversation about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia together, right? And in a way that doesn't acknowledge grief, right? Not just from this like humanist perspective, but because people really are grieving people they know and people they don't. So I think that's, yeah.
Just briefly, I think a lot of work has to be done in our own communities. We're all part of multiple communities at once. Some of those are communities of political solidarity, some of those are religious communities, some of those are ethnic communities, and I think those don't always, the relationship is not always isomorphic, right? So I can't speak to what should be done within Jewish communities. I think we already have a pretty robust anti-Zionist Jewish movement, and I think that should be supported. What I can say for myself within Muslim communities, within kind of Iranian communities and so on, what I find myself doing is making sure that certain equivalences are not made, and certain that people don't support the Palestinian cause for the wrong reasons, right? And the wrong reason includes things like the Jews are this or that, right? Like making anti-Semitic claims about the Jewish people, or the wrong reason might be something like supporting the Islamic Republic and its policies in Iran, right? So disentangling dominant politics within Iran, for instance, from the Palestinian cause. I think one of the worst things that has happened to the Palestinian cause is the Iranian political establishment. So that's work that I see for myself, but I think it's different depending on where you stand and where your allegiances are.
I think as a Palestinian, sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think I have a couple of thoughts. One is that I agree that we shouldn't use, Islamophobic tropes, but I want to really emphasize that this is not a primarily Muslim-Jewish conflict. This is a conflict. And so I think that there's also anti-Arab racism and anti-Palestinian racism as well that are at play here. And sometimes there is an unholy alliance between those and Islamophobic tropes. I think the two feed into each other. But I think it's really important not to, not to forget that point. I mean, listen, as a Palestinian, I love to tell the story of how, you know, in a previous life, I was Muslim Student Association president at the University of Michigan, and also active in Michigan's version of SJP. And I wore these like funny different hats, right? Because as MSA president, I did all this interfaith stuff, and so I would like go to a church, or I would go to Shabbat dinner. And you know, J Street was very active on campus, and this one guy from J Street, who I was sort of friends with, I mean, we would see each other in class, would, I mean, we weren't really, we were acquaintances at best. He would come up, you know, and he really wanted to have these Muslim-Jewish dialogues, right? Which I rejected because, again, they make it seem like it's a Muslim-Jewish conflict. But also because fundamentally, even as a kind of Palestinian issue, I cannot be expected to debate my humanity. For me to debate with someone who, Zionism is built on the idea of the dispossession of Palestinians. You can't have one without the other. You cannot have Zionism without the dispossession of Palestinians. There is no liberal Zionism is still Zionism. And so I'm not going to debate with Zionists. And so I think that I think I agree with Eli Riza that that people need to work within their own communities. And what's interesting about this kid from J Street, you know, and he's like, but you came to Shabbat dinner, because he was so convinced that my problem with the dialogues had to be anti-Semitism. He's like, but you're not anti-Semitic, and you have all these Jewish friends, and you came to Shabbat dinner. Like, make it make sense, you know? And I'm like, it makes sense, because this is not my problem. And funny enough, he ended up leaving J Street and helping found If Not Now. So I think that the work is happening, and I don't think anything I could have said to him would have ever convinced him to move in that direction. It was Jewish folks who moved him. And so I think that's really important. We have to work on our own people, and Eli Riza's right. Within the actually, one of the least anti-Semitic places is probably the Palestine Liberation Movement, because people are on the lookout for anti-Semitism, because we're getting accused of it all the time. And people do police each other on it. People are like, don't say that. You know, like, people are extremely vigilant about it. But it has to be, I think, like all organizing, it has to happen within communities. So.
I hope these answers have helped, because I really have nothing to add.
We're going to take a moment to take our question from online, and then we'll get back to you.
Question online is for Professor Dusta. Can we compare the efficacy of violent versus non-violent resistance in the Palestinian issue? What criteria would we use to make that analysis or comparison?
Oh, I have no idea. Yeah, I'll leave that to people better informed than me.
If you look up Jeff Goodwin's work at NYU, he wrote an article. He's a sociologist who studies this. I think he wrote it with another sociologist, Neda Mata, that talks about the kind of logic of violent resistance on the Palestine side. So it's often portrayed as senseless or useless, and they kind of make the argument that you can actually trace the gains from various violent resistant efforts. And again, that's not to justify atrocities, etc. That's just from a purely social scientific analysis. I'm not familiar enough with the work to, I think, summarize it any more than that, but I can turn people towards it, because at the end of the day, I'm a professor, and I think everyone should step up.
And the only group that has ever gained concessions from the Israeli state without strings attached is Hezbollah. Right? That's actually been the only really successful campaign, which was obviously a violent one.
I just have the question of, I don't know if it would answer this, but I was wondering, because I saw something about like, how the, like, I don't know,
Palestinian and I'm tired.
Could you reiterate for us, and then I can.
Yes. Okay, let me read it. So I was just asking, like, what they believe that the Arab world or the Arab League would do, and then in which ways or not, like, would they use their power, or why wouldn't they as well?
So the question is the use of power,
Yeah.
and whether or not that is justified, whether or not that is.
No, by the Arab
It's
world.
like what's in the
What
Arab
the
world?
Arab-
Like other Arab countries.
Yeah, like, why or why not would they
I
like
see,
say
thank you,
something,
yes.
you know?
So a collective measure by the Arab world in response to the situation.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the response,
I can say one thing, which is I think the hope among the sort of the ruling class of the Arab states is something along the lines of the West Bank, right? So a Palestinian population that is largely subdued, gives up its political claims, and yet lives in some reasonable modicum of financial well-being, right? Which is a complete mirage, because that's not happened. That hasn't happened in the West Bank, right? But the idea being that if you, say, put some money into the West Bank for development, for jobs, for entertainment, or whatever, that people will be happy enough that they won't want freedom, right? I mean, I think that's kind of been the model within some of these Arab states themselves, right? I mean, look at the UAE, look at Saudi Arabia, look at Egypt, any of them, right? The political dispossession in return for a combination of iron hand state, strong security, sort of massive security apparatus, but then some modicum of social freedoms and financial well-being. But again, I don't think that works, partly because people want freedom, that's just the fact, and partly because the Israelis are not willing to give up on expansion. So I don't think they know, maybe that's not.
People want freedom and people want return. I mean, there are 5 million Palestinian refugees in the region who largely don't have political rights in the places where they've ended up. Egypt doesn't give citizenship to Palestinians. Lebanon doesn't give citizenship to Palestinians. I mean, so I think that, first of all, the Arab ruling classes are themselves in many ways, controlled by U.S. interests, but also are not representative of their people's wills and desires. And if you need proof of that, look at all the protests that have been happening all over the Middle East. So they, at the one hand, don't want to be the place where more Palestinian refugees end up, and they also don't want to intervene, leading to the ire of the United States. And so I don't think the solution is ever going to come from Arab nations. I think Arab nations have consistently sold out Palestine. They've done it over and over and over and over, and I think they will continue to do it because these aren't ruling classes that are interested even in their own people's well-being. So the solution is always going to come from within Palestine. And yeah.
And I would just like to echo what Amon said. Fuck the Arab world. I think what the leaders of the major Arab states hope for is that the Palestinians will just go away. They'll just be quiet. Why do they have to keep making trouble? Why can't they just accept it? They lost in 1948. Why don't they just calm down and try to make a life? And the answer is because you won't let them live. You are gradually but inexorably exterminating them, and they are not going to take it. They are alive, and maybe not so well, but they are still there, and they will not be quiet. So nobody, I think, counts on the Arab world to do anything decisive in this. To me, the most hopeful thing I felt in the last year was the uprising, not in Gaza or the West Bank, but the uprising in Israel against this fascist government, which had the potential some elements of it, we're saying, yes, and while we're throwing out Netanyahu, let's throw out this whole apartheid system at the same time. There, I think, are a significant number of Israelis who are fed up and know that this will not cure itself with the help of the Arab world or with the help of the religious settlers and the fascists who are in control of Israel right now.
Question that is that not when you look at the international politics, UN is responsible for this, and then applies when I'm seeing the history and developing just to Palestine. So the purpose of the existence of this organization is for the world, but it is not what it is. It clearly sees that they are biased to one side. So why, as a civil company, how we can stand up against this for them to allow that what's the point of your organization?
Just wanted to reiterate that. If you could, I'm not so what if the United, the question was, what's the role of the United Nations, and if the United Nations is built on an idea of
bias. Because
right,
I think like even the land dividing division, why they're supporting one side more and opposing the other side too.
I mean, in my view, it's the United Nations itself is a fundamentally problematic organization, right? And it's an organization. It's an organization built on essentially maintaining the post-World War II order, right? And Israel emerged within that order, right? Like as the United Nations was forming. And if you look at even within that problematic system, though, it's interesting to see the vast discrepancy between, say, General Assembly types of decisions, where every nation has a vote, right? Versus Security Council, where the five powers have veto. Right? And it's the Security Council decisions that are really the most significant. Even there, though, I mean, increasingly, I don't know what matters, right? Where Security Council resolutions are made, you know, is if kind of China and Russia, you know, they each do their own thing and the U.S. does its own thing. It's just increasingly irrelevant, which is a big problem, right? Because again, post World War II, this was supposed to be an organization that arbitrated, global problem, but we don't have that anymore. In a sense, I mean, one of the best things that has happened maybe in the last few years, ironically, is that China has emerged as a kind of a heavyweight, right? And that because its primary interests globally are economic, it has been able to some extent to sort of undo some of the damages that American global politics does, right? But again, that's no substitution, right? It's just a slight kind of improvement.
I think global revolution would be great. Nobody listens to me.
I think that's what should happen.
Yeah, I think that there's lots of reasons to not like the UN. It's not the most effective place to point our ire, I think. Right? Because really, as long as the US is sending billions in military aid, I think that's the decisive question.
Yeah, so the solution might just be economic collapse in the U.S.
Yep.
My question is, how should we approach discourse on this topic when it seems that the Western media and Western countries generally are essentially displaying a sense of guilt for the horrific atrocities faced by the Jewish community during the Holocaust, while also toting Islamophobic tropes and anti-Arab racism, and are therefore more likely to label one as anti-Semitic while speaking out on their events?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, so the question was how do we combat the current discourse, especially given that you said Western nations were sort of, were acting from a place of guilt over the Holocaust, over, you know, the oppression of Jews. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think Western discourse is so good at projecting its blame on other people. It's actually kind of wild. You know, in Great Game of Thrones, where like the white lady goes around freeing all the slaves from right? Did nobody? I was like, what? Okay, let's set that aside. Not my best example. Let's move on. I mean, I think that ultimately, yeah, I mean, I think ultimately we have to continue to remind people of history. I mean, I think one of the most difficult things about being any kind of activist in this country, right, is that there's, an enormous media machine, that's a media war machine that we saw in Iraq, we saw in Afghanistan, we're seeing now again, but also that there's such an enormous sense of amnesia, right? Political amnesia is really central to the American project. I mean, I think especially because, I mean, this is a country and a culture that wants to believe itself to be a beacon of light to the world, right? And a beacon of progress to the world, but is actually a country and a culture that has been built on domination, enslavement, and theft. And so I think, you know, sometimes I think many of us were looking at the rhetoric these past 2 weeks and thinking, how could this possibly be what people are saying, right? When like the truth is so obvious. And I think on some level it would take a fundamental change of self to see Palestinians as human beings and to see Palestinians as an oppressed people, right? It would take it has to come with the destruction of a settler colonial mindset that is so fundamental to this country, and to a white supremacist mindset that is so fundamental to the entire Western world. And so I think on some level we have to always simultaneously be fighting all of these ideological structures that are interrelated with each other. So I think that's why the world that's why Palestine is such a huge issue all over the world, because I think everyone else in the world sees it for what it is, as a manifestation of the West at its worst. The West doing exactly what it has done for the last, you know, however many centuries, right? Which is to decide who's human and who's not, who's worthy of protection and who's not. So we have to be fighting that ideological structure. But unlike any other generation in the world, we have more access to content production than ever before. We have more ways to connect with each other than ever before. We're more educated than ever before. And so things are different, and they're going to continue, I think, to get better, hopefully. Yeah. Woo!
And I think what you put your finger on is the job of educators. The media are transmitting an incredibly distorted picture of what is going on now and what has gone on for the last 70 years in Palestine. It's our job as educators to not let history get erased, to make sure that it continues to be taught. And this is true. I think we need to recognize the state of siege is also around American universities right now. I watched CNN last night for a few minutes and saw a panel discussion about us and about the fact that the only place this conversation can take place is at an American university, and it's endangered. Students for Justice in Palestine is endangered at campuses all over the country. So we need to recognize ourselves as, I don't want to compare us to Gaza, but there are different kinds of sieges. There are sieges of resources, space to speak, ability to communicate, and it's very, we talked about this at the beginning today, whether is this session the kind of thing that the famous Calvin report urging freedom of speech and free exchange of ideas on this university campus? What does that have to do with this meeting? And why should that even be a question? Do we need to check our Constitution to find out if it's all right to discuss these things? I'm afraid if CNN has a reporter here, please say this was a very civilized meeting with lots of smart observations made, and there was no demonizing or race baiting that I heard. This was an example of high-level life of the mind in action, but it's an endangered thing. We're going to fight for universities' historic task of preserving historical memory, preserving the records, making sure that the past is not erased and that reality is not papered over with fantasy and ideology.
We are exceeding our time, but we did so semi-intentionally as we started a bit late. I think we'll have time for one more comment that I saw over on this side of the room. I will, as we move towards close, just briefly mention with the capacity that we're currently at, there will be a strategic move towards exiting the building. So please, let's not all rush out at once as we wrap up, but we will do our best to move you along in a rapid fashion. So with that, please.
Thank you all for your comments. Thank you for organizing this event. My question goes back to political strategy and thinking long term, because my fear is that we're going to be having this conversation 25, 30 years from now as well. Professor Mitchell, you mentioned your trip to Israel in 1970 and the conferences that you've attended. And this year marks the 75th year of the Palestinian tragedy. So we've known about this for a long time. I think we've known about the solution. Some of you have even pointed out what needs to happen in the short term. For example, the ceasefire and the admitting of humanitarian aid, and others have talked about a one-state solution. But I think what we're missing still is a theory of how to get there, right? So what we haven't talked about is that's where we want to be, but we have no idea what we should do to get to that endpoint. And I would say that as I see it, and I think everybody also sees it, but maybe we're not saying it, the major obstacle or roadblock to peace in that area is the US and its involvement, and the fact that it does not take an even-handed approach to the conflict and sort of puts its thumb on the scales on one side. And so the relationship between the US and Israel needs to be broken, right? And I think that is fundamental. And there are many strategies out there. There's BDS that's doing good cultural work. But how do we break the relationship between US and Israel? And I want to go back to the idea of the consensus in this political system when it comes to Israel, both Republicans and Democrats. And so what I think should happen, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is a wedge needs to be driven between Democrats and Republicans on this issue, and one side needs to say, no, we're not gonna support this. And I think that can only happen if we discipline the Democratic Party in the same way that it's disciplined us over the last 30 years. Going back all the way to Clinton, when he did the counter messaging against unions that led to NAFTA, we worked for the party as opposed to the other way around. And I feel like the only way to get them back in line and serving us and our interests as people who care about peace in the world is to punish the party for its crimes against humanity, and to say none of you will ever be back in office until you pledge that you will never give a single dime to that racist apartheid state that is murdering Palestinians on a daily basis. Unless we can say that strongly, all of the things that we've discussed that we know, I think. I think some of the things that we've discussed will not have come as a surprise to anybody. We know what the contours of the conflict are, but we have to talk about strategy. We have to talk about how we get to to peace, which everybody's calling for. How we get to a free Palestine? You should try to reiterate that question.
Well, I mean, I agree. Are we reiterating? Yeah. Well, you know, basically, how do we get to strategy? How do we drive a wedge between the Democratic Party and the State of Israel? How do we get to a strategy? I totally agree with you, obviously, because we've talked about it and we're trying to write about it, about not, you know, about basically disciplining the party with our votes. But I also think it's about really amplifying the dissent of other voters as well, because for, you know, I think the Muslim vote and the Arab vote is important, and I think it's more important than the Democrats realize or are willing to admit to themselves and others. And it can be taken away, and they're very unwilling to admit that to themselves or others. But I think also we need to be amplifying the issue, and I think that's exactly what we've been doing. I mean, I've had people, I know that it feels, and this is really especially to folks in the audience who have been posting about this all, you know, for 2 weeks, and it feels like you're shouting into the void. But I've had people from parts of my life, you know, college friends who are not political at all and who don't know anything about the conflict, right? Reach out and say, like, I'm learning so much from your posts. Or people say that about Twitter. And, you know, I'm sure that most of the people looking at my, you know, Instagram or my whatever are, you know, in the echo chamber. But also that matters, right? Because we're all teaching each other about the conflict all the time. And in doing so, we're kind of preparing people to be able to answer questions. And basically, you know, we don't have the $1 billion PR machine that Israel has, but we do have each other. And I think that's really important. I think it's actually a lot more effective than they realize. And I think that those changes, those demographic changes in the level of support for Israel have also been a reflection of that work, of SJPs on campuses, of TikToks and Instagrams and all the things. So I think that work needs to continue to happen, because in order to drive that wedge between the Democratic Party and the State of Israel, we need to basically turn popular support away from the from supporting Israel.
I just want to add one thing, which is American politics has been so long organized around the so-called culture wars. And the Palestinian cause, one of the things that's helped it, I think, is just its various intersectional connections over the past few years in progressive communities. But we also have the so-called progressive accept Palestine contingent, right? So I think that's what needs to be radicalized, is that you can't be pro-women's rights, you can't be pro-immigration, you can't be pro-queer rights without also being pro-Palestine. You know, you really...
To some extent, I'm reiterating, but yeah, I think that the focus on the political parties is not a helpful focus, right? I think that getting there eventually, perhaps, but the focus on the political parties is how we get Biden, right? Because then there's always the question of like, oh, but what about the centrist vote, and what about this? And I think focusing first and foremost on, as everybody said, on actually generating that popular support first, and on educating, but maybe we're saying that because we're educators. But I think that that's really the first step, and that if we direct it towards the parties, not only are we skipping that first step, but I think it has the danger of just kind of sliding into the most milquetoast sort of Democrat that appeals to Republicans. Oh, also just dismantle the two-party system.
Please, go ahead.
And if any panelist wants to like end with a comment for, especially the university community, which I think is like suffering from a lot of fear at the moment, whether in classrooms, whether in public spaces. So as educators, I think it's important for you to remind students what their education is about. So please, like, I think in one way this is a way for, this has been an event in many ways to remind everybody their Calvin Report rights, but also the fact that they're not alone and they need to read through the fear. So yeah, please make a comment there.
I will say that, first of all, I think a lot of us are extremely traumatized. I don't know about you, but I spend multiple hours a day crying just because of everything that's being taken, that we're taking in. And I just want to really, we know from the literature in the sociology of education that students of color are not always, don't realize that they can ask for support. So I just want to reiterate to everyone here, if you are struggling to do your coursework, to show up to class, first of all, go get the mental health resources that you need, but also tell your professors, just reach out and say, this is what I can do, and like your whole life doesn't have to tank because you're paying attention to this issue. For those of you who are activists, keep doing what you're doing. University campuses have always been the center of radical activism in the United States and across the world. For every major issue, it has always started on university campuses, and I don't think that's a coincidence. And I will say that along that vein, tomorrow, SJP has asked me to share with all of you that they are holding a strike and rally. Palestinian Society in Gaza have asked us to strike in solidarity with them tomorrow. There's going to be a rally at 2:30 outside Levy Hall, and a march to follow, so see you there.
Thank you all for attending. We should all once again thank our welcome. Please let us not stampede each other. We would like to do this with some bit of system here. So if you are sitting down, if you were lucky enough to have a seat for this whole thing, just sit tight. Those that are sitting closest, please exit. We'll get the back wall next, and then the far left, those that are sitting will be followed, and then those seated.
What is she teaching? What?
Thank you. Along the back wall, if you would like to exit now, that would be appreciated. I think those on the far left that were seated can now exit as well. All right, thank you, and everybody else is now dismissed. Thanks so much.